Hilchos Bikkurim Ushar Matnes Kahuna Shabagvulin Perek Chamishi. The laws of the first fruits and the other Kohanic gifts that apply throughout the land of Israel, chapter 5. We had 4 chapters dealing with Bikkurim, the first fruits, and now we're moving on to the second part of the name of these laws, the other Kohanic gifts throughout Israel. The first gift, which we're going to be spending the most time on, is challah, the obligation to remove a part of the dough when we make a dough for baking and give it to the Kohen. Today people might be more familiar with the current version of challah, which is to also remove a piece of the dough and then to burn it, but that's not the original way that it was done. Originally it was actually meant to be a gift to the Kohen. Kohanim and Leviim didn't have their own land, and hence they couldn't produce their own crop and their own produce. And part of the way to respect them and to honor the fact that they were serving on our behalf in the temple was to give them these different gifts, including challah, a piece of the dough. And for the next 4 chapters, that's what we're going to be discussing, the halachas that relate to this gift of the dough. It says the Rambam halacha aleph mitzvah saseh. It's a positive commandment, lahafrish truma min ha'isa lakoyen, to put aside a separation. Truma means an elevated portion from the dough for the Kohen. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, reishis arisei seichem challah torimus truma. The beginning of your dough as challah. Challah means like a little baked good. That's the literal translation of the Hebrew word challah. You should separate challah as a separation. Now this beginning, all it says in the Torah is the beginning of your dough. How much is a beginning? There's no biblical amount, minimum, to how much you have to give. Even if you put aside the size of a barley corn, a tiny amount of dough, you've exempted the entire dough. You can go ahead and eat the dough, and you give that small portion to the Kohen. On the other hand, if you want to dedicate your entire dough as challah, you've done nothing until you leave over some of it. You have to leave some of it for yourself. Torah calls it your dough. The beginning of your dough you give to the Kohen. If you give the whole thing to the Kohen, there's no beginning. You gave it all away. So biblically, there's no minimum amount, but you can't go all the way to the maximum. You can't give away the entire dough. Halacha beis u'midivrei seifrim. Nevertheless, the rabbis came in and gave an amount, rabbinically speaking, shemafrishin echad me'arba ve'esrim min ha'isa. One must separate 1/24 of the dough which they make, kedei sheyiyeh ba kedei matana lakoyen. So there should be enough to be considered a gift to the Kohen. Shenemar, because elsewhere, when it talks about other gifts, not about challah, but when it talks about the truma, when it talks about the first shearings, which we'll discuss later in these laws, the Torah uses the word titen lo, you shall give to him. Tein lo davar haroi litne matana, means you have to give to the Kohen something, an amount, which would be significant enough to be called a gift. And hence, when a regular person makes a dough, 1/24 is the amount that the sages decided is fitting to be called a gift. If a baker makes a dough to sell in the market, mafrish echad mishmeina v'arbaim, he needs to put aside actually a little bit less, only 1/48 of the dough, lefisha yisase meruba, because his dough is usually larger. When you make dough for sale, typically you make a bigger quantity, and therefore yesh b'shir zeh kadei matana, the sages estimated that 1/48 of a baker's dough will come out to be a significant amount, which can be called a gift. But that's the basic dividing line. A regular person makes a dough, 1/24, a baker makes a dough, 1/48. Says the Rambam Gimel, ha'oisa isa lemishte b'noi. If somebody makes a dough for a feast of his son, afal pisha hi meruba, even though here you're also going to be making a bigger quantity. You're making for a feast, you're going to serve a lot of people. It doesn't give you a license to give less. Mafrish echad me esrim v'arba. Since you're a regular guy, you must separate 1/24 of your dough for the Kohen. Shalei lechalek be'isas ba'al habayis, so that we don't differentiate within the dough of a regular homeowner. The same thing on the other side. If a baker makes a small dough for whatever reason, he only has to give 1/48. Not to differentiate within the dough of a baker, every baker gets the license of 1/48. If the dough that a person is handling became ritually impure, so now there's less of a motivation, less of a reason to give more to the Kohen, because the Kohen anyway cannot eat it. So the Rambam says, if the ritual impurity was contracted inadvertently or by forces beyond the person's control, he gets the license here. It's the one time that a homeowner gets a license to separate less than 1/24. He only has to give 1/48. But if the person actively, willfully, purposely transmitted ritual impurity to the dough, mafrish echad me'esrim v'arba. We're going to force him to go with the 1/24th, kadesh lo yehi chayte niskar, so that a sinner doesn't benefit. Bechala tmeya. What is the law of challah, which became ritually impure? Muteres lakoyen lahasaka kitruma tmeya. It's permitted for the kohen to use it as fuel, like impure truma. Let's say, unlike Bikkurim, where we saw the other day, that if it becomes impure, nothing you can do with it, or Ma'aser Sheni, the same thing, Truma and Challah, the Kohen can use for fuel. Halacha hey, ein chayavin b'challah min ha'Torah, ela be'eretz Yisrael bilvat. Biblically speaking, the obligation of Challah is only applicable in Israel. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, v'hoya ba'acholchem milechem ha'aretz v'geimer. It will be when you will eat from the bread of the land. That's when you should give the Challah portion to the Kohen. Meaning, it has to be a time when you're living in Israel. And it only applies to the bread in Israel. Ubizman shekol Yisrael sham. Additionally, not just geographically in Israel, all the Jews need to be living in Israel. Shenemar, as it says in the verse before that, b'vayachem. It's a very unusual word. Usually the Torah says, ki savayu, when you will come. Here the Torah uses b'vayachem, as you enter, which is a much more encompassing terminology. Bias kulchem v'le bias miktzaschem. It's interpreted to mean the coming of you all, not the coming of a part of you. All the Jews need to be living in Israel. Lefichach, therefore, challah bizman hazeh, the obligation of challah nowadays, afilu b'mei Ezra be'eretz Yisrael, even not only nowadays, even back then in the Second Temple times, when Ezra the scribe came back from the first exile in Babylon, and he came back to Israel, the whole obligation was only rabbinical, as we explained with Truma, because not all the Jews came back to Israel a second time with Ezra. Halacha vav, peiris chutz ha'aretz, shenichnesu la'aretz, if you have produce from the diaspora that came into Israel. And the commentaries explain the dough was made then in Israel. In other words, the produce came in raw from outside of Israel, and the dough was made in Israel. Chayavin b'challah. They're obligated to have challah taken from them, because even though the produce came from outside Israel, but the dough was made in Israel. Upeiris ha'aretz, sheyatzu chutza la'aretz. On the other hand, if produce from Israel was taken out to the diaspora, and then the dough was made over there, p'turin, they're exempt from challah in that case, even though the produce came from Israel. Shenemar, because the verse says, Asher ani mevi eschem shama. This is the verse that introduces challah. It says, when you're going to come to the land, that I am going to bring you there. Shama atem chayavin, which means over there, you're obligated. As long as you're there in the geographical space of Israel, you're obligated in challah. Bein al peiris ha'aretz, bein al peiris chutz ha'aretz, whether the produce came from Israel or the produce came from outside of Israel. Halacha zayin mafrishin challah b'chutz ha'aretz midivrei sofrim. Even though there's no obligation to separate challah outside of Israel, we nevertheless do, rabbinically. We separate challah outside of Israel, so that the laws of challah don't become forgotten from Israel. Ever since, think about it, since the first temple times, we didn't meet the biblical requirements for challah. So if we just stopped doing it, certainly if we stopped doing it in the diaspora once all the Jews were exiled, we'd forget about the whole mitzvah. So the sages wanted to keep it going. So they said that you should separate challah rabbinically. But however, challah that's separated outside of Israel, we don't bring it into Israel. The same way we don't bring in any other things. Truma, Bikkurim, the first fruits, we don't bring it into Israel from outside of Israel. If you did, you simply leave it till the day before Pesach, and then you burn it anyways, because you have to burn the chametz. Kitruma, like you would do with truma. You wouldn't want to burn it straight up, so it shouldn't look like you're burning challah just, for no reason, but you are going to burn it with the chametz on Erev Pesach. Halacha ches. Shloisha dinin lechala b'shalosh haratzos. If we speak about Israel's terminology in relationship to the diaspora and in relationship to itself, we come up with 3 laws pertaining to challah in 3 different lands, 3 different geographical spaces. We're going to remind ourselves what the Rambam told us in the beginning of the laws of Truma, when he described the borders of the land of Israel, that there was twice that the Jewish people came into Israel and inherited it. Once was when they came the first time, after the 40 years in the desert with Yehoshua. That's called Oile Mitzrayim, the Jews that ascended from Egypt, the part of Israel which they possessed. And then we have what's called the Oile Bavel. Second round, after the Jews were exiled after the first temple destruction, when they came back to the second temple, they conquered again Israel in a bit of a different way. They went further out to the east, it's called the Oile Bavel territory, but they didn't conquer as much upwards and downwards to the north and to the south. So, because of this, different laws developed in relationship to the laws that apply in Israel. Because as we learned in the laws of Truma, and the Rambam is going to reiterate it in the next book, the original Kedusha, the original holiness that devolved on Israel when the Jews conquered it, when they came from Egypt, was only there so long as they lived there. Once they left, it departed. But the second time, when Ezra came up and made it holy, he made it holy for then and forevermore. And therefore, that's the holiness which we kind of look at in relationship to the laws today. And that's going to influence the different laws of challah as we're about to see. The Rambam says as follows: Kol ha'aretz shehechziku ba oilei Bavel ad kiziv. All of Israel's map, which was conquered by oilei Bavel the second time, those that ascended from Babylon, until Kiziv. It's hard to see exactly, but Kiziv is over here. And even though the actual city of Kiziv is outside the area of the red where they conquered, but it's parallel to it. The border is parallel to Kiziv. That's why it's called Ad Kiziv, because that was the northernmost extension where they conquered in the land of Israel. So the Rambam says, from anywhere in Israel up to that point in the north, mafrishin b'chala achas kashir. Every time you make a dough, you take one portion of challah, normally the proper amount, v'hine echeles l'kohanim, and it's eaten by the kohanim. The proper way, that's in Israel proper according to all options, and so you give it to the kohanim. Ushar Eretz Yisrael, but the rest of Israel, shehechziku ba'olei Mitzrayim v'loy olei Bavel, which was conquered by the people who ascended in Egypt, but not the second time round when they came from Bavel, shehini Kiziv v'ad Amonah, which is from Kiziv till the area called Amonah, which is a pretty great debate. But somewhere up there in the north, says the Rambam, mafrishin b'shtei challah. What you have to do is, you have to separate twice challah. Ha'achas nisrefes v'ha'achas ne'echeles. One portion which is burnt, and one portion which is eaten. And then Rambam immediately explains why. Why are we separating these two challahs? Goes like this. The first dough which you're going to separate is going to be impure, because that part of the land did not become holy the second time when Ezra came up and sanctified it. And the first holiness was canceled, as I mentioned before, once the Jews went into exile. Therefore, halachically speaking, it's not part of Israel. And any land that's outside of Israel, as we alluded to earlier in this book, and we're going to deal with extensively in the Rambam's 10th book, there's a ritual impurity imposed by the sages on all land outside of Israel. So since this portion is outside of the Oilei Bavel Israel, the dough that you separate is automatically impure. Nevertheless, v'hoyil v'hi Eretz Yisrael, since it is in some ways still the land of Israel, mafrishin b'chala echad me'arbaim u'shmeina v'serfei neisa. So what we do is we separate challah, 1/48, a smaller amount, and we burn it. U'mafrishin challah shniya v'noisnin oisa l'koyin la'achla, but we can't suffice with that. Even though it's true, it's impure and it should be burnt, we have to separate a second time challah and give it to the kohen to eat it, k'dei shelo yomru, so unassuming Jews shouldn't say truma tohira nisrefes. Look at this. We have totally pure truma. They're not going to know that it's impure because of the sages' imposition of ritual impurity in the lands of the nations. All they see is a pure dough. You took a piece of dough and you burnt it. Why are you burning truma tohira? The first dough is getting burnt, even though it didn't become impure in a way that everybody can see. So you must take a second time, which you're going to give that challah to the kohen to eat, so people will know, oh, okay, there was a part that they gave to eat, fine. But this second one, because it's only being done to take care of the Jews that may not know fully the laws, so we don't have to take it with any specific amount. It has no amount. Whatever you want, you can take it because it's only rabbinic. Now, once you pass Amana, going to the outside, it's not even Israel for the first round. It's totally outside of Israel. Bein Besuria, Bein B'Shararat, whether you're in Syria, which is an area that was conquered by King David and has a quasi-Israel status in some laws, or certainly if you're any other land of the diaspora, Mafrishin Shtei Chalas. They also separate twice challah, achas lesreifa. One goes to be burnt. We can't just give the kohen to eat it. It's outside of Israel. It's literally impure. Everybody knows that outside of Israel it's impure. If you're going to give it to the kohen who's going to eat it, people are going to say, hey, you're eating truma tmei, you're eating impure truma. It's not allowed, so you have to burn it. The achas la'achila, but we still take one part and we do have it eaten, so the Jews don't forget the laws of challah. Now, since it's only the second one, so there's no problem, because they've already seen one challah be burnt, so they know we're dealing with a different category of challah. We burnt one and we're just eating this, just to keep the memory alive. In this case, since both challahs are rabbinic, mutav l'rabes b'ne'echeles, it's better to give more of the eaten portion. Lefichach, therefore, shall sereifa ein lashir. The one that's being sent to be burnt should have no amount. Hayala kolshu, take whatever you want. V'shalachila, the one you separate to eat, should be echad me'arbayim u'shmeina, should be 1/48. Umuteres lezavim u'lezavos ve'en tzarich leimar l'shar tmeim. In this case, the challah can be eaten even by zavim and zavos. Zavim and zavos are men or women that experience a discharge that's not like semen. It's another type of gonorrheal discharge of some sort. For a woman, it would be more of an irregular blood flow. And certainly any other people who are ritually impure, they can eat this challah because the whole challah is ritually impure to begin with. Halacha tes bisman hazeh, nowadays, if I wasn't clear before, halacha ches was the way it used to be even in temple times. This whole one challah, two challah thing that applied even in those times. Nowadays, she'ein sham isa tahira mipnei tumas hameis, there's anyways no such thing as a pure dough, because we're all impure from corpse impurity and we cannot become pure again because we don't have the ashes of the red heifer. Mafrishin challah achas b'chol eretz Yisrael echad me'arbayim u'shmeina v'serfenes. So now in all of Israel we separate only one challah, 1/48, and we burn it. Mipnei she'itmeya v'yesh la shem min ha'torah, because it's on the one hand impure, but it's also biblically mandated in some way. And therefore, in biblical Eretz Yisrael, in other words, that was conquered by the Eli Bavel, one challah burnt. So in that way, the law in Israel is different than previous times. Because in earlier times when there was a possibility to be pure, so the Rambam said in the beginning of Halacha Ches, we take the proper amount, 1/24, to give it to the Kohanim. Here, now you have to burn it. Umikziv va'adamana, but in the upper part of Israel, the part that wasn't reconquered the second time, mafrishin shniya la'koyen la'achila ve'en la'shir k'shehaya hadavar mikayden. We retain the way it used to be. We take a second challah for the kohen to be eaten with no specific amount, and we give it to the kohen. So we end up taking two challahs in the upper part of Israel. Halacha yud chalas chutz al aretz. Challah separated in the diaspora. Afal pisha hitmeya, even though it's impure. Hayil ve'ikar chiyuva midivrayim, since the whole fundamental obligation of it is rabbinic. Eina asura ba'achila ela al kayin shetuma yaitza alav migufa. The only person who's forbidden to eat it is a kohen who has a ritual impurity coming from his own body. The haim, which they are balei krayin, people who experience a seminal emission in the night. The zavim, and a man who experiences a gonorrheal discharge of some sort, v'zavos, a woman with irregular blood flow, v'nidas, a woman on a menstrual period, v'yoldes, a birthing woman, u'mitzarayin, and Jews who contract leprosy, tzaras. Avol shara tmeim b'maga shara tumais, but other people who are ritually impure because they touched a source of impurity, but it's not coming out from their own body. Afilu tmei meis, even if you're impure from touching a corpse, mutarim la'achla, technically speaking, they can eat challah outside of Israel. Lefichach, therefore, im hayasham kayin katan b'chutz al haaretz, if there was a minor kohen under bar mitzvah outside of Israel, bein b'Suria, bein b'shar haratzis, whether in Syria or in the other lands, v'ratza lahafrish challah achas, and they wanted to separate one challah and give it to the kohen, mafrish echad me'arbayim u'shmeina, you can separate 1/48, v'ne'echeles lakatan, and it could be given to this minor, to this child. Sha'adayin le'ra'ah keri, because he probably didn't have any seminal emissions yet. Or lik taima sha'adayin le'ra'ah sanida, or to a young girl who never experienced menstrual blood flow. And there will be no need to give a second one because they're technically able to eat chal in the diaspora. Halacha yud aleph v'cheinim hayasham kohen gadol shetaval mishichva zarei mizivasei. So too, if there was a kohen who was an adult, not kohen gadol, the high priest, kohen gadol, a kohen who was an adult, who had a seminal emission or had a gonorrheal discharge, but he went to the mikvah to purify himself. Afal pisha leheriv shimsha, even if the sun didn't go down, you're still called a tvul yoim, waiting for the sun to set after going to the mikvah. Afal pishu tmei meis, even if we're dealing with ritual impurity of a corpse, hariz mutter lechal achala harishayna, he can eat the first challah, ve'ein tzarich la'afrish shniya b'chutz al haaretz, and no need to separate a second time in the diaspora. Now, all these laws are not really kept today. Today we just burn everything. We don't want to get into the problems of ritual impurity and purity, so we take a small piece and we burn it. Halacha yud beis kol hamafrish challah. Anybody who separates challah mevarich techila first makes a blessing. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvaysa v'tzivanu lahafrish challah. When you are right there with the dough, Hashem sanctified us with His commandments, and He commanded us to separate challah. Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. You do this in Israel and outside of Israel. Also, you make the blessing in both places. The same way you make a blessing for a pure dough, you make it on an impure dough as well. Therefore, a naked man cannot separate challah, for he cannot make a blessing in front of his genital area. But if a woman was naked and she sat on the ground and her entire genital area is covered by the ground, she has the possibility to make a blessing and separate challah, whereas as a man, genital area projects. With a woman, it can be covered by the ground completely, and therefore it's allowed to have a blessing be made, even if she's unclothed. Halacha yud gimel hanida v'chayetzeba. A menstruating woman, or similar to her, mevareches or mafreshes chalas chutz la'aretz. She can separate and make a blessing on the challah in the diaspora. she'eino muzheres al maga ela al achilasa, because she's not warned against touching challah, she just can't eat it. And if there was a minor kohen or an adult kohen who went to the mikveh, who can then eat it as we explained, he can eat it with a non-kohen on the same table, this diaspora challah, because it doesn't create meduma, doesn't create a problematic mixture. Even if it was mixed equally, 1-to-1, because it's only the diaspora, so it's not that holy. The nois you can even give it to an unlearned kohen, because it's anyways impure from the airspace of the nation's land. Also, the laws of a kohen helping out to get his gifts, which is usually forbidden, doesn't apply here. Right? A kohen can go to the granary to help out and then get his truma. So here also, but here this law doesn't apply because it's impure anyways. Also, if you wanted to eat first and then separate challah in outside of Israel, mutar, it's allowed, because the whole thing is rabbinic. Usually in biblical challah speaking, you have to take the challah first before you eat the dough. But here you want to eat before you separate, that's okay. It's because it's the diaspora. Halacha yudal da challah nikras truma. Challah is called truma, right here it is. Challah tarimu truma. Therefore, it can only be taken when the produce is in the same location or even in some ways attached. You have two doughs, you can't take one from the other unless they're attached. Also, initially speaking, you shouldn't take challah from a pure dough to cover a impure dough. And we'll deal with these laws extensively in the coming chapters. Any case which we said about truma that a person should not separate, but if he did, after the fact, it's also not truma. Any case where we said by truma that you shouldn't take the truma, and even if you did, after the fact, it's not truma. Same thing with challah. As an initial preference, you shouldn't take it, and even if you did after the fact, it's not challah. Any species where we said you shouldn't take truma from one to the other, you shouldn't take challah from one to the other. Anybody who cannot eat truma cannot eat challah. Any kohen who can eat truma can eat challah. There's one exception. Hasuma v'hashikar mafrishin challah lechatchila. A blind person and an intoxicated person can separate challah even as an initial preference, even though truma they couldn't separate. Why? Because we said that truma, there's a special law, you must take min hayafeh, the choicest portion. They can't differentiate between choice and non-choice portions. But when it comes to challah, it's okay. When it comes to the dough, we don't have the law of bad quality, high quality, which would require them to be concentrating and separate the choice portion. There's no such thing as choice portion. Therefore, a blind person and a drunk person can separate challah if they so desire.